of Love and Responsibilities, New Jersey. What we're going to talk about today is attractions and distractions. So according to St. Pope John Paul II, physical attractions are what first get our attention as human beings, which is not necessarily a negative. But we must not focus on the physical and look beyond it. It is important to get to know the other person and their personality to get to know one another. It is important to discover whether there is a common goal to get to heaven. So I'm not the professional, so please help me give a warm welcome to Brian and Eni Honsberger.
We really focused on relationships last week. This week, we're going to talk about a little more rules. And if you think about it, think about the types of rules that the Catholic Church has for a man and woman who are dating, but not yet married. Not very popular, right? How about the rules between a married man and married woman? Also not too popular in today's society. If we want to do Family Feud about that, we could, right? We could yell out the hot topics, right? Here's the thing. Annie and I were married 8 years. We got married when she was 23 and I was 24. We, through our dating relationship and through marriage, have lived according to the teachings of the Catholic Church, through and through. Do you believe that? And don't forget that last week I started our talk with, we're here because we're happy. We have a very busy week right now. We just came back from, last time we saw you, we got on an airplane and we just got back. So we've been like traveling all over the place. She's finishing her master's, she's writing on airplanes, she's reading on airplanes. We're here not because of any other reason except we're very happy and we want to share our story with you. And our story is that we discovered not the teachings of the Catholic Church, we already knew them. In fact, the whole world knows the teachings of the Catholic Church. What really changed our lives and what drew us to the Church and also to each other was actually the reasons for the teachings of the Church. So I think just knowing the reasons is not convincing, but understanding the reasons for the teachings is convincing. All right, so the great thing about the book that we're talking about, which is Edward Shree's Men, Women, and the Mystery of Love, you could read it in a weekend. It's an easy read. The beauty of this book is that it'll give you a lot of what we talked about last week and also this week. The topic for this week in that book is 10 pages long. So I'm going to give you a little bit more than that, which will be a little bit of theology of the body. If you haven't studied theology of the body, this will be an introduction. And then we're going to go into attractions and distractions. And by the way, the distractions are very important because, of course, attraction is good, but the reason why Annie and I love each other more and more over time and grow in intimacy is because we're not just focusing on what we're attracted to, but we're also aware and bewaring of the distractions. All right, so the Bible is a really long book. And a lot of scholars have argued as to what the Bible is about. I'm going to make my own argument today, and that the central theme of the Bible is marriage. Has anybody heard this concept before?
Yes.
Think about it. First book of the Bible, marriage between Adam and Eve. Last book of the Bible, marriage between Christ and the church. So Revelation chapter 21, it's the second last chapter of the book. God descends from heaven. Man ascends, like humanity, not just like one dude. Ascends from earth, and where do they meet to marry one another? Somewhere in midair. It's kind of weird, but it makes sense if you study it enough. The last book of the Bible in English we call Revelation. And notice how it's singular revelation. Don't let anybody ever say revelations. There's only one revelation. And in Greek, what's the name for the last book of the Bible? Apocalypse. What do you think apocalypse is? Doomsday, end of the world, fire, brimstone, right? Everybody dies. Not quite. So think about apocalypse. Well, the word apocalypse means to reveal, and it's actually very much so the most dramatic moment of an ancient Jewish wedding. So the most climactic moment in a Jewish wedding today is what? Right? But back in the day, in the time of Jesus, the most climactic moment in a Jewish wedding was actually the unveiling or the apocalypse. So the man would stand on this side, the woman on this side, and the man and the woman often didn't know each other very well. That's a whole other thing. But he would lift the veil of his bride and see his bride face to face as husband and wife for the first time. That's the unveiling, or the Revelation's a good translation, right? Or the apocalypse. All right? So when we talk about apocalypse, is it the end of the world? It depends on whether you think marriage is a good thing or not, right? So we see that the last book of the Bible is about marriage, the marriage between God and humanity. In fact, the purpose of our existence, the very purpose of our existence, is not to find the love of our lives. Remember last week? Annie said the most beautiful thing out of anybody last week. She said that what's the best thing she ever did? Was becoming Catholic. It was about her relationship with God. The second best thing she did was marry me, right? So our end is to be with God, and it's weird because like God could love us in many different ways. Which way does He choose as His primary way of showing and displaying His love to us? It's actually in the marital sense, that passion that a man has for a woman or a woman has for a man. That's kind of like the type of passion God has for us. All right, so our end is union with God in heaven forever. That's our purpose. Got it? Moving on. Jesus confirms this on the cross. As He breathes His last breath, He dies, and what happens? There's an earthquake, and the veil of the temple is torn. What do you think that means? It's at Jesus' death, that sheet that covered the Holy of Holies, that kept some type of separation between God and humanity, is torn, and God marries the church at Jesus' death. All right? So what's our main attraction? What's the main attraction of every single person in this room? Marriage with God in heaven. Jesus calls it the heavenly marriage banquet. All right. So the Bible is full of marriage, right? It begins with marriage, it ends with marriage. If you open your Bible exactly halfway, you'd find a book called the Song of Songs, which is basically erotic love poetry. Jewish boys weren't allowed to read it until they were bar mitzvah. And basically it's the story, it's an allegory of God's passion for His bride, which is humanity. Jesus talks a lot about marriage. This is one thing He says. You all know it. So He's quoting Genesis, and 21st Americans have this lack of desire to even hear what Genesis has to say because it's historically and scientifically inaccurate, right? Who cares about what Genesis has to say if it doesn't even admit that dinosaurs existed? How many days did it take for God to create? 7, yet the world is billions of years old, right? So there's a contradiction, and therefore we should just write off everything Genesis has to say, right? What does Bible mean? What does Bible mean? As a little kid, I was taught that Bible means book, which is actually incorrect. Who here speaks Spanish? You've heard of biblioteca, right? What does Bible mean? Library. How many books are there? 73. And you guys remember Blockbuster? Am I dating myself? I'm 33 years old. I'm not that old. I'm 34. All right. You guys remember Blockbuster? Yes. All right, so you're walking on the left. There's like there's horror, sci-fi, right? On the right, there's new releases, comedy. And in the back, there's the black curtain with you know, like the Song of Songs. So there's different genres, right? There's different genres in every library. If the Bible is a library, there's different genres, right? So let me just give you a few. So there's historical books. And the beauty of these historical books is that they're actually very historically accurate. They're the best, like 1st and 2nd Maccabees, if you ever read them, read them. They're the best source of historical material we have from the time of Alexander the Great and a few, Antiochus Epiphanes and the elephants that were used in battle. Like these are real historical documents that help historians in their field. There's other types of books though, right? Psalms, right? Poetry. Proverbs are what? Proverbs. So we have many different genres. Then there's books like Ezekiel. Ezekiel's a fascinating book because it's a mix of genres. There's history, there's poetry, there's a little some crazy stuff going on. Which type of genre is Genesis? It's also complicated. If you read an English version, which I don't recommend, it's written in paragraph form, and it's gonna look. You probably just read it like a novel. But if you read it in Hebrew, from like right to left, guess how it's structured? The creation stories, Genesis chapters 1 through 3. It's in stanza form. It's in stanza form. It's poetry. It's actually better than history and science. It's metaphorically and theologically precise and accurate. The aim of Genesis is to tell us much deeper truths than questions we have about like the moon and so forth. All right, so what Jesus cares about is what we care about. And Jesus cares about Genesis, and therefore we care about Genesis, right? So we're not going to impose our 21st century scientific and historical critiques on a book that doesn't desire to be historically or scientifically accurate. Get it? Can I move on? All right, let's do it. All right, so what does Jesus say? He says, go back to the beginning. So he's giving us advice on the ultimate, the second attraction, which is marriage. So how many days does it take for God to create? 6 days. I like that answer. 7th day, he just chills out, right? And then, if you notice, you've probably noticed this, but maybe you haven't read this since you were a kid. Days 1 through 5, there's a formula for creating, and this is the formula. Then God said, let there be whatever, a dome, light, and then it happens and it's good, right? Very simple. How many creators are there in days 1 through 5? How many? 1. Yeah, 1. All right. Day 6, humanity is created and the formula changes. What is the formula? Notice how different it is. Then God said, let us make man in our image after our own likeness. And is it just good? Muy bueno. All right. So notice how different this is. How many creators are there in day 6? Using the text, let's not jump ahead. Using the text, 3. More than 1. A plural amount. All right. And we have to ask big questions, right? Because remember, Jesus told us the answer to these questions, but the Jewish people for thousands of years didn't have these questions. Who is the us? Somebody yelled out Trinity, yes. But who is the us? And what does it mean to be made in God's image? What does it mean to be made in God's likeness? If I were translating the Hebrew, I might use a different word instead of image, maybe icon. What does it mean to be made in the image of God? It means that we look like Him, right? To be made in the image of God means that we look like God. How could we look like God if He's invisible? That's a question. We won't answer it yet. What does it mean to be made in the likeness? Well, I can't even say God. Are we made in the image and likeness of God or the us? Look at the text. Are we made in the image and likeness of God or the us? It's the us. Now, God is in the us, correct?
Yes.
But we are not made in the image and likeness of God necessarily, but in the image and likeness of the us. So what does it mean to be made in the likeness of the us? Does it mean that we're like them or that they like us? We know that they like us because we're very good, right? Right? But what it means to be made in the likeness of something is that we're like them. So basically, to be made in the image and the likeness of us means that we look and act like the us. Is this making sense? Mm-hmm. All right. And also a crazy thing is that we're very good. So in Hebrew, there's no word for very. So you just repeat the word twice. So humanity is good. And if the Bible said humanity is good, what would that mean? We're the best, right? But we're not. We're good. And by the way, if you go to Mass and you ever hear us saying things 3 times, it's not for the sake of repetition. It's translation, right? When we say, God, you're holy, 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 what are you saying? God, you're the holiest, right? All right. That was a sidetrack, sorry. So Adam is created and God says what? God says he's not good. So everything that God creates is good except humanity, who is very good. But Adam is created before Eve, right? And God says that Adam is not good. What's wrong? It's not good that he's alone. So only in the context of Eve does Adam make sense. Let's think about this. Don't look at me or Eni, look at the whiteboard. And picture Adam naked, by himself. He's alone. Think about his maleness. Think about his male anatomy. Does he make sense on his own? No, only in the context of Eve, physically, does Adam make sense. As soon as Eve is created, what does Adam say? This is bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh. He's reflecting on her physical complementarity to him. Bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh, right? Sounds like something Jesus says in John 6. We'll get to that. So this physical complementarity is a beautiful, beautiful thing, and God gives them a commandment. The first commandment God ever gives to humanity. Remember, this is a talk about rules, right? What's the first rule God gives to Adam and Eve? To have sex. Which is pretty freaking awesome, right? So God does a good job. And so, yeah, he says, be fruitful and multiply. Fill the earth and subdue it, right? So we see that there's a model that he's developing, God is developing. So let's talk about it. We got Adam. Is he the giver or the receiver, physically? We have Eve. Giver or receiver, physically? Receiver. Which one's in charge? Which one's dominant? What's that? Think about it. It's a trick question. Oh yeah. I'm never going to ask a not trick question. They're equal, right? How could one do without the other? We can tell that Eve wasn't an afterthought because Eve was not an afterthought because Adam didn't make sense by himself, right? Eve was always a part of the plan. In fact, if you really study Genesis, does creation get more complex or more simple as creation progresses? More complex. It starts with a dome. It starts with light, with very simple things. And then it gets more complex and beautiful. So who is the pinnacle of creation? Woman. Eve. All right. So, but Adam has something to give, and Eve is just a receiver. Doesn't that make Adam better? Think about receiving. Remember last week I did the flower to the pretty woman? And I said the flower can't be forced. Think about the giver. So a man wants to give a woman a beautiful flower, a beautiful woman a flower. So who's in charge right now? Who's in charge? The receiver, right? I'm putting myself out there, and I'm afraid, right? I'm vulnerable because she could either accept it or deny it, right? So let's not try to act like Adam's in charge and Adam's dominant to Eve. They're equals, and if anybody's in charge, it would be the receiver. And this is an allegory of God, the giving and the receiving, right? Who's the giver? And who's the receiver? Who's the bride? Us, right? So God is making himself vulnerable, putting himself out there, hoping that we accept that flower. And by the way, the secret to the spiritual life is receiving, right? We don't take, right? We don't take the Eucharist, we receive the Eucharist. We say, amen, I receive, right? All right, so their union, Adam and Eve, their union proceeds, sends forth what? Be fruitful and multiply. Kids. All right? What does this have to do with being made, with looking and acting like the us? What does that have to do with looking and acting like the us? It seems like it has nothing to do with it, right? Let's talk about it. All right, so Jesus, who said Trinity? Who said Trinity for the us? You're right, you're right. This is your job. So it's the Trinity, right? And Jesus makes this clear 2,000 years ago in the Gospels. So Jesus has weird things to say in long monologues in the Gospel of John that most of us don't listen to when we're at Mass. But if you really pay attention, it's awesome stuff. So in John chapter 6, Jesus talks about his relationship with the Father. He says this, "Everything that the Father gives me, I retain. And I don't lose any of it." Isn't that a weird thing to say? But think about it. If God pours himself out completely, utterly, to all of us, and we receive, let's say, 1%, that might be enough. Because God is infinite, right? How much of God's love and outpouring and grace did Jesus receive? 100%. So Jesus is the perfect receptacle of what the Father gives him. So we have Father, the giver. We have Son, Jesus, the receiver. In John 16, Jesus talks about his relationship with the Holy Spirit. Do you ever wonder why Jesus isn't here right now? So he dies, he resurrects. If he just hung out here on earth and continued to work awesome miracles, we wouldn't have atheists, right? We wouldn't have many problems. Why did he leave? Why would he ascend into heaven? He gives a reason in John 16. He says, if I don't go up to become one with the Father in heaven, you won't receive what?
Holy Spirit.
And we say this at Mass every Sunday, right? We believe in the Holy Spirit, the Lord, the giver of life, who proceeds from the Father and the Son, and who with the Father and the Son he's worshipped and glorified. All right? Do you see how humanity looks and acts like God? And notice how family-like this is. How do we imitate God? It's through marriage. It's through family. Is Catholicism an individualism type of religion? No. What matters more in Catholicism? Is it me or is it my family? It's my family, right? So we're not an individualistic religion. All right, let's move on. So after Adam and Eve are created, they're given that first commandment, be fruitful and multiply. They're given another commandment, which is don't eat the fruit, right? You guys remember this? There's the tree. Don't eat the fruit. If you eat it, you'll what? You'll die. All right? So let's move to chapter 3 of Genesis. Enter an evil bad character. So the serpent has a proposal for Adam and Eve. He actually has two proposals. Proposal number 1 is, if you eat the fruit that's forbidden, you won't die. All right? So that's basically a direct contradiction of what God just said, right? So this turns into a trust game. Am I going to trust God, who said if I eat the fruit I'll die? Or the serpent, who says if I eat the fruit I won't die? Very simple. The second proposal the serpent gives is, if you eat the fruit, you'll become like God. You'll become like God. Isn't that a little messed up? Because how does Adam and Eve look and act like God? It's this, like the total gift of self, the total receptivity, and the sending forth of children. So what is the serpent saying? No, you got to eat this forbidden fruit. So what do? They eat it. Do they die? No. So who is telling the truth? Or did they die? They eventually die physically, right? So they were eternal beings. They eventually die physically. But there's an immediate change in their spiritual life, right? Notice the changes in Genesis 3. We all read the story, I hope. What changes? What happens? It says, as soon as they eat the apple, their eyes are opened, You remember that detail? Their eyes are open, and they see that each other are naked, and they're ashamed. And then they go and hide, right? Who do they hide from? They hide from God in the bushes and shrubs, right? Who else do they hide from? Yeah. They put clothes on, which suggests that they're hiding from one another, which is very sad. Think about a husband and wife protecting themselves against each other. That's sad. Big spiritual death that happened within them. All right, so what did we lose? Well, by the way, so did the serpent lie when he said he won't die? It was a half, yeah, notice this next slide, you saw that next slide. It's a half-truth. So we're talking about attractions and distractions, right, today? We're talking about rules. Rule number 1, avoid the half-truths. We have to understand that God is trustworthy, and it's very easy to kind of be swept away from what God has to say. All right. Let's talk about why they were so ashamed at their nakedness. Doesn't this, so eating a fruit and then seeing each other as naked and being ashamed, there isn't a great connection there, right? Like, how do they connect? Think about it this way. There's a woman in the shower, a beautiful woman in the shower. She's getting out of the shower, she's drying off, and then a teenage boy runs in. What's the first thing she's going to do? She's going to cover up. Some people say scream. Yeah, probably both at the same time, right? But why? It's almost like instinctual at this point, right? But why would she do that? Yeah, like I was saying, it's almost instinctual, right? But I think what she's trying to do is protect herself, right? From what? From a objectifying glance from the young boy. She's afraid that he will look at her with his own gratification in mind. And that's the part of each human being, that chain that we feel after the fall. And Edward Shree in the book talks about this. And he has this great quote, we should read it. He says, "Sensual attractions separated from the rest of the human person are a great danger, and it quickly falls into utilitarianism." In other words, there's a bad part of each of us, because of our original sin, that desires to use others for our own gratification, as opposed to the total gift of self, right? We're not going to talk too much about total gift, because that's what David's talking about next week. But the key here, and the rule here that we're talking about, is that we can never take an entire person who is a very complex, beautiful human being with dignity, infinite value, as we said last week, right? We can never take that person and only see them for one of their attributes, right? Only the emotional side, or only the physical side. Free will, friendship, virtue, total commitment, and self-giving love must accompany sexual intimacy. What is sexual intimacy without free will? What would we call that? Yeah, not good, right? Once you start taking one of these things out, it could get really ugly, really dangerous, really fast. And people start getting dehumanized. What is sexual intimacy without total commitment?
Adultery.
It could be, adultery, or we'll use the technical word. Recreation is a good word. Technical word would be fornication, right? Fornication. So once we start taking things from somebody that's not just everything, we fall into dangerous territory. All right, so what did we lose at the fall of humanity? There were 4 relationships that were kind of messed up, and that Jesus has to come, like God has to actually become a human being and save us from these 4 lost relationships. So the first and most important relationship lost is the relationship between God and who? Who? Man. Yeah, God and man. I'm just filling in the blanks on the board here. The second lost relationship was the relationship between man and who? Woman. The third relationship, man and... Oh yeah. Someone knows what they're doing over there. Man in himself. The fourth one is man in nature, yeah? Jesus comes to fix these problems for us. And it's wonderful because he gives sacraments to solve each of these problems. What sacrament does he give to fix our relationship between man and woman? Marriage. And so forth and so on. If you have more questions about that, we can talk later. Concupiscence. Concupiscence is that desire in us to eat the fruit that's forbidden. That still remains in us. It's still there, even with the sacraments.
Thanks for the mic, right? I love when he talks theology, so great. So, distraction, worship of spouse, boyfriend, girlfriend. What is worship, right? As Christians, Catholics, we should reserve our worship for God, right? But what we find is that we end up worshiping our spouses or our boyfriends or girlfriends. And a quick story about Brian and I when we were dating in regards to this. You know, Brian made it very clear that he fell in love with me first, which he did. And I soon followed his lead. Eventually I fell in love with him as well. But in the course of our dating, he said something to me. Like, I remember just being so in love with him, and like, he was the greatest guy. And he said something so profound to me that I remember to this day, and it has helped guide me in my relationship with God. He said, I love you and I want you, but I don't need you. And I was like, damn. Because in my mind at the time, like no, I needed him. And so when he told that to me, that really made me take a step back and be like, whoa, he doesn't need me. That's deep. And so that affected me, and it really turned me to my worship and relationship with God.
Cool story. I didn't know that story. So, what happens? What happens if we worship? If we put a person, any person, especially a significant other, in front of God? If we care more about this person than God, what do we do to them? We idolize them, and we also put a lot of pressure on them, right? Like, if this person is our God, well, we all need a perfect and flawless God, all-powerful God. If that person, and it's guaranteed that person will live up to those expectations. Basically, worshiping your spouse or your boyfriend or your girlfriend crushes them. It destroys them, and it destroys the relationship. So the only way for marriages to last, for relationships to blossom into marriages, is to put God first. So ultimate distraction, one of the great distractions is to worship each other. If God doesn't come first, the relationship will fall apart, I promise.
Definitely.
And don't forget that the worship of God involves following his rules. All right. Remember we talked about repeatable and unrepeatable qualities? Every person is infinitely valuable and unique. And because every person is infinitely valuable and unique, we should not be, especially men, dudes, listen up. We should not be developing a taste of women that makes us constantly run and chase after certain body types that we prefer, right? If we get married to a 25-year-old, guess how old that 25-year-old will be in 40 years, right? So if what you're attracted to are repeatable qualities, as your wife gets older, you're going to be more attracted to the 25-year-olds on the beach, right? And nothing angers me more than seeing an old man at the beach, more interested in other women than his own wife. Can you imagine what kind of cloud that has over the relationship? It's almost like he's still looking. How that would make a woman feel, it's terrible. All right, moving on. Oh, and by the way, God's punishment If anybody's looking for some real fire and brimstone Bible reading, take a look at Romans chapter 1. What's God's punishment for people who are constantly following their passions instead of loving and giving themselves to their spouse? What's the punishment? It's so weird, but God actually lets us do it. That's the punishment. He lets us even like it. So St. Paul says that he gives us over to our passions. So he's not going to affect our free will. So it's something that we have to do with God's help and the sacraments. All right. And this is where we're getting, remember, Jesus has a lot of things to say about marriage. He says, everyone who looks at a woman with lust has already committed adultery with her in his heart. So what's the first sin? They eat that fruit. They look at each other. They're ashamed. Is that lust? Yeah. But is the result of sin lust? No. The result of sin is self-centeredness, right? Where does the love go? Remember, the love of Adam was an arrow going to Eve? Where does the arrow go after sin? It goes back to himself. So what is lust? It's sexual self-centeredness. It's the using of another. So anybody who looks at a woman, objectifying her, commits adultery with her in his heart. That's what Jesus has to say. Something we want to avoid. And boom, I dropped it on you. And I love this quote from John Paul II. Take a look at it. Fascinating, isn't it? Why does it show too little? Because it's reducing a person to just one aspect of them. It's dehumanizing them. It's turning them into a sports car, right? Remember I said last week that we all have free will and the ability to choose? Well, the more we fall into certain things, the more we actually give up our free will. It could turn into something that actually becomes a habit, and from a habit to something that can't be controlled. All right, so we do have free will, but we also tend to give up our free will through addiction. And a lot of studies have been done about pornography and how it rewires our brains. It changes the way we look at other people, the way we think about other people. All right, and this is really important. Probably for the men, this is the most important slide of the night. How do we differentiate love from lust, right? How do we differentiate beauty from unity? Couldn't somebody look at like Playboy magazine and say, well, I'm just appreciating their beauty, right? I'm not using them, right? In fact, they like it, right? So what can we say to that? How do men judge whether they're acting in a way that is admiring beauty or objectifying another woman? Let me give you the test. It's a litmus test. So, does viewing a beautiful naked woman statue at like the Vatican Museum, does it point you to God and to worship of God and to respect for the beauty of womanhood? Or does the love turn on oneself? And do you desire to gratify yourself with this woman, right? I think that's the way to do it. So you need to be focusing on the other and focusing on, does this bring me closer to God?
For women too, right? We need to understand that it works in the same way, whether it's, movies that we watch, seeing Prince Charming and this perfect guy, or there's what's that movie, Grey?
50 Shades.
50 Shades of Grey. See, I haven't watched it. But it works the same way with women. And what it is that we find objectifying men, and for whether it's their money or whether it's their handsomely, devilishly good looks.
Did you get a chance to read this quote? Take a look. This is kind of a really not so read quote in the Bible. Sorry if I'm in your way. So, I input is soul output. Did you ever go on a retreat and just like sing songs and read scripture and then find the world to be just an abomination, right? Why? Because you just you just did eye input for a couple of days. So turning off the TV and reading, whatever you bring into your mind is what's going to come out. All right? This is a new distraction that's especially heinous, but are you familiar with this? It's getting more and more popular. Watch out. Watch out for that. We're running out of time, so I'm going to fly. Go ahead.
So quickly, love and responsibility. Emotions comes with responsibility as well. And some of us know people who are just always, I feel this, I feel this. I was having a conversation with my sister recently, and she kept talking to me about her feelings. I said, no more feelings. Let's use the intellect. How is this, like, let's go beyond our feelings. And it's dangerous to do that. So another story really quickly. It's about Brian. So ladies, I must say, marrying a good, solid Christian man is so important because they really, if they're a good man, they lead you into a beautiful relationship with God. So thanks, husband. Yeah, okay. So with Brian, I remember when we first were married, you know, because we were dating for 4 years. I was the love of his life, and then, you know, you get married, and I was just like, hey, you know, you used to write me love notes. Like, where'd that go? And you know, used to. So then I realized, like, this has kind of stopped, and I kept telling him, like, I don't feel like you are paying enough attention to me. I do not feel like you are doing this. And then once I stopped doing that, once I stopped doing that, I started spending more time with God. I was like, okay, well, he's busy with work, I'm busy with work, so let me just spend, and that is what made me, he didn't do anything different. He has not done one thing different, has not written me a note since I asked him to do it. But what has changed is me and what is important, and not being ruled by my emotions, but focusing that on my relationship with God, because the deeper our relationship with God, we don't need the other person to fill in that emotional gap. That becomes very dangerous.
Amen. All right. Oh, and you guys are going to hear this a lot if you watch the Kardashians or The Bachelor or The Bachelorette. Like, everybody's saying, I'm going to follow my heart, right? Don't follow your heart. Don't do that. The heart is good, and emotions are good, right? Yeah. Right? Emotions are good, and every good relationship, there's emotional aspects to it.
But they shouldn't dictate.
Yeah, we don't follow our heart. Our heart follows us, right? We're in control. Okay. All right. So, and what do we do with our hearts? We guard them. What did God say to Adam? He said, "Keep the garden. Keep it. Like, guard it, like a goalkeeper, right? Lift up your heart. Remember, at Mass we say." We lift our hearts to the Lord, right? Right before Eucharist. Speaking of Eucharist, let's go to attractions. All right. The ultimate attraction we have, marriage with God in heaven, right? The next attraction, healthy marriage, including the entirety of the person, right? We're not just liking certain aspects of people, we're loving the entire person. So we think of marriage in the Catholic Church as a symbol of God, right? Because it looks and acts like God, but it's also a means to God. Marriage offers endless opportunities to not satisfy our own desires, to satisfy the desires of your spouse. The married people are shaking their head like, yeah. I want to go home and lay on the couch. The dishes aren't washed. What's the self-sacrificial thing for me to do? Wash the dishes. Like endless amounts of opportunities to love your spouse every day instead of loving yourself. So marriage is a training ground for marriage with God in heaven. The family. Remember, we're not an individualistic people as Catholic people. Read this by Frederick Laplay. He's awesome. Can you see it? The solution to our problems in the United States is Catholicism, not individualism. All right, and then lastly, Eucharist. So what does What does Jesus say, or what does the Bible say about Eucharist? They're at table, he takes the bread, he breaks it, he gives it to them, and what happens? Their eyes are open. Does that sound familiar? Right after the tree, right after they ate, they lose, there's that spiritual death, and they lose that original innocence. Their eyes are open. What reverses it? Eucharist. Eucharist is union with God in a marital embrace right now. This is an attraction too, all right? Thanks.
Overcome by the joy you're bringing, with your words in our hearts still ringing. Let us join with the angels singing, your love will find a way. So come down, come dwell within our hearts, Lord. Come now, come dwell within our hearts, Lord. Come down, come dwell within our hearts, Lord. Come now, come dwell within our hearts, Lord. Oh, it's only grace that matters, heaven and earth forever after. All bow down before you, Master, your love will find a way. Overcome by the joy you're bringing, with your words in our hearts still ringing. Let us join